Good afternoon. My name is Mary Murphy, and I am the Nancy L. Puck Pembroke Center Archivist at Brown University. On behalf of the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women, I'm happy to welcome you to the 2021 Shauna M. Stark Out of the Archives lecture series with this year's speaker, Professor Daphne A. Brooks. Today, she will be presenting the talk sort of like an archaeologist, exploring the archive of a blues music feminist. She will be introduced momentarily by my co-curator and friend, Professor Ann Ducille. To set just a bit of context for those of you who are beaming in from across the country and maybe the world, and you might not know, the Pembroke Center was founded in 1981 and took its name from Pembroke College in Brown University. Pembroke College had served as Brown's women's college and had merged with the men's college a decade earlier. The Pembroke Center continues the legacy of the college through interdisciplinary research and teaching, exploring social inequalities and examining how categories of difference, such as gender, race, class, and religion, affect our thinking and our world. The center is a recognized leader in scholarship about gender and sexuality at Brown and internationally. The center is also home to Brown's educational program in gender and sexuality studies, as well as the Pembroke Center Archives, which is my responsibility, and which preserve and celebrate the history of Brown alumni, the history of gender and sexuality, and the history of feminist theory. In 2016, the Pembroke Center teamed up with Professor Ducille, a Brown University Graduate School alumna and visiting scholar emerita, also Professor of English Emerita at Wesleyan University and author of multiple books, including Skin Trade, The Coupling Convention, Sex, Text, and Tradition in Black Women's Fiction, and Technicolored, Reflections on Race in the Time of TV. Together, Professor Ducille and Pembroke Center leadership established the Black Feminist Theory Project, which aims to raise the voices of Black feminists and to preserve their vital archival legacy. Since that time, Anne and I have partnered on the curatorial element of this initiative, resulting in the preservation of the papers of Hortense J. Spillers, Cheryl Wall, the papers of Ducille herself, and those of Christina Sharp. In due course, the Pembroke Center's Black Feminist Theory Project will also preserve the papers of Hazel V. Carby, Deborah E. McDowell, Mireille Miller-Young, other notable scholars, and I'm very happy to say, those of Daphne A. Brooks. I encourage you to visit the center's website to learn more about the Black Feminist Theory Project and its collections within the Pembroke Center archives. Now I'd like to welcome Professor Ducille, who will be introducing our honored guest today, Professor Brooks.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. Our guest this afternoon, Dr. Daphne A. Brooks, the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, Theater Studies, American Studies, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University, is a rock star. And I don't mean that simply as a euphemism. It's true that as the author of critical texts such as Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances of Race and Freedom, 1850 to 1910, winner of the Errol Hill Award for Outstanding Scholarship on African American Performance from the American Society for Theater Research. Jeff Buckley's Grace, and her brand new, hot off the presses masterwork, Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, published just this month by Harvard University Press and already listed as a bestseller on Amazon. And she's also the author of numerous articles, essays, book chapters, liner notes, and therefore she is the star at the forefront of multiple fields and a key player in several popular as well as academic venues. Her liner notes for the complete Tammy Terrell and for Aretha Franklin Complete on Columbia have both won the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for Outstanding Music Writing. And her recently published liner notes essay for Prince's Sign of the Times deluxe box set is destined for the same kind of recognition. To do fuller justice to Professor Brooks' credentials and accomplishments would take more time than we have, but I'm sure you see some of what I mean when I say she's a rock star, carving out the contours of a Black feminist intellectual tradition in sound. But Dr. Daphne also rocks. Her intellectual labors are informed, inspired, and shaped by her lifelong love of music. I heard a rumor, in fact, that she came out of the womb bopping. When the doctor slapped her to make her cry, she slapped him back and burst into song. So as I thought about how to introduce her this afternoon, the answer was obvious, sonically, of course. But alas, I most definitely do not have the gift of song myself. I defy all the stereotypes about the innate musicality of my people. So the lyrics I'll end this introduction with, are hers, not mine. In one of her best-known, most influential essays, Sister, Can You Line It Out?, Zora Neale Hurston and the Sound of Angular Black Womanhood, a personal favorite of mine, now a chapter in her new book, Dr. Daphne says of Hurston, Bessie Smith, she was not. While no scholar in her right mind would dispute the fact that Zora Neale Hurston revolutionized and revitalized the voices of Black folk in her fiction, drama, and anthropological scholarship, you most likely be hard-pressed to find anyone who would call her a great singer. Most people, in fact, may not even know that the Harlem Renaissance rebel writer sang at all, let alone that during the late 1930s, she readily and dynamically performed and recorded a colorful array of songs that she herself collected out in the field, on the open road, in her now legendary automobile, Sassy Susie, in the boisterous leisure gatherings of Florida locals, and all along the railroad line, where day laborers hammered on their sorrows, pleasures, and desires in intricate percussive melodies. With its lush lyrical prose, this passage speaks to one of the many things I most admire about Daphne Brooks. She always digs deeply and goes boldly where no scholar or critic has gone before. How lucky we are that she not only maps the route, but also takes us along on the journey. Please join me in welcoming Daphne A. Brooks.
Andrew Seal, Andrew Seal, Andrew Seal, intellectual hero who taught me everything that I needed to know about striving to write with eloquence and care, style and wit, analytic rigor, and a commitment to telling the stories that had not yet been told in the Black archive and in the American cultural archive more broadly. I'm not worthy of that introduction, but I'm so grateful to you for being here and for paving a way for me for many years now, many years. So thank you, Andrew Seal. Thank you to the entire Pembroke Center. I want to thank Mary Murphy for this invitation to be here, to Diane Straker and the rest of the staff at Pembroke, also to my broader Brown diaspora that's out there. Too many names to list, but especially Trisha Rose and Matt Gutturl, Francois Hamlin, Patty Ibarra, Dixie Ramirez, Sophie Abramowitz, who I hear is in residence this year, brilliant scholar of the blues. Watch out for her work. Thanks for having me this afternoon. So I'm going to be discussing an absolutely extraordinary archivist who answered the call of Dinah Washington, who sang out to us just a few moments ago as we were coming into the Zoom room, "I want to be loved," right? This archivist answered that call by loving, absolutely adoring the archive of blues women's musicians. So the story that I'm telling today is a politics of care in the archive, right? And it's one that has inspired me deeply in my own work. Amazingly, as I have a reputation for sharing a lot of sound in my presentations, and usually it's a wild ride. But today it's just images and a lot of words from this particular figure. So I hope you'll bear with me, although I'm happy to queue up some of the recordings that she made possible for us to have in this moment at the end, if we'd like to do that, or during the Q&A. All right. So if there were any critic or collector who would have been an especially passionate steward of the aforementioned Zora Neale Hurston's historic recordings, it probably would have been the Jewish feminist activist, intellectual, and entrepreneur Rosetta Reitz, the dynamic, absolutely dynamic Reitz, who proudly wore both such hats throughout her tireless career, would have likely gone to great lengths to care for, to study, to protect, to preserve Zora Neale Hurston's sound scholarship. And pun is intended there. But Reitz's voluminous archive surprisingly shows little trace of Hurston's labors. Her absence from the feminist public historian's records perhaps says everything about the extent of Hurston's obscurity in the 1970s, since Reitz, or early 1970s, before Alice Walker famously recuperates her for the ages, right? But it says everything about Hurston's obscurity, since Reitz would have found her in terms of her sonic archives if she could have. She was a beast of a collector, as the young ones might put it, a super wonk, who above all else devoted her life to Black women's sonic cultures, and a woman who would ultimately produce some of the most extensive and trenchant critical thought and writing about Black women musicians that had ever been published. Born Rosetta Goldman on September 28th, 1924 in upstate New York, the woman who would ultimately become a maverick in feminist blues record collecting, record producing, and Black feminist music programming, managed the demands of single motherhood in the 1960s while bouncing through a series of jobs that often reflected her new left, second wave social and cultural sensibilities. From running her own Four Seasons bookshop in Manhattan to writing a weekly food column for the Village Voice in the early 1970s to publishing Menopause, a positive approach, a book of the month selection in 1978. Wright sustained a multifaceted career for many years as a New York feminist activist and local cultural figure before setting on a line of work that became her passion and priority for the last 3 decades of her life. In the wake of completing Menopause, she turned in full to the world of blues women, and she often would tell anecdotes about the ways in which she was writing Menopause and got through writing that book by listening to so much Bessie Smith. And when she went looking for other blues women's classic recordings, they were all out of print. And so she set about the project of reissuing them. So the connection between that book, Menopause, and her dedication to African-American women's music is one that she would highlight often in her many press interviews to promote the record label that she established in 1979 with $10,000, culled largely from donations provided by women who, quote unquote, knew and respected her work. I was nurtured by these women and their music, Reitz told Black feminist journalist Jill Nelson in a 1980 interview. I got courage, strength, and wonderful energy back from them. I almost feel as if I owe them a debt. They got me through, end quote. Rights framed her commitment to promoting the import and legacies of blues women's work as in part a kind of feminist public service designed to broadly disseminate to other women the kind of nurturance that long forgotten recordings had given to her. Quote, I put their records on because here I was, a woman nurturing children, and on the job, giving to the job and the bosses, and coming home and having to give. So who was feeding me? She continues. These women fed me. I feel that I owe them something because I got so much from them, end quote. A self-avowed feminist before the word feminist was even invented, Rights articulated personal as the political, as the cultural, as the professional narratives about the birth of her label, Rosetta Records. The first and only record label devoted entirely to specializing in women's blues and jazz music, Rosetta Records was the pinnacle of Rights' achievement as a feminist historian and entrepreneur. In a career that spanned from the 1960s to her death in 2008, Wright moved fluidly from running the label to teaching college courses at the New School in Manhattan, delivering campus lectures, and organizing full-scale concert events with artists whose work she lionized and for whom she fought hard to gain the critical and public recognition long denied them. As she explained in a letter to, of all people, Bessie Smith's adopted son, Jack G. Jr., and his attorney, quote unquote, I am a women's jazz historian who works hard to get more women written into the history of American music for their contribution to it, and written with great dignity and seriousness than it is often afforded them when they are included. That vision would drive Rights to produce a total of 17 album compilations, though she had been aiming to make 26, ranging from commemorative collections of a single artist's work to thematic concept albums that focused on the pioneering contributions of musicians who were kindred in aesthetic spirit, foremothers, mean mothers, independent women's blues, as well as subgenres of blues women's songs that focused on the Great Migration, railroad women's blues being a germinal work in this collection. As jazz pianist Dorothy Donegan, one of the many sister musicians whom Rights befriended and championed in her lifelong efforts as a blues archivist would put it, she was, quote unquote, sort of like an archaeologist. She is brave, adds Donegan in a 1992 interview with the LA Times. She puts her money where her mouth was. She's helped women who would have gone unrecognized. She helped me. She brought back things I had done during the 1950s that would have been lost, end quote. In what was arguably her greatest achievement as an archivist and a producer, Rights collaborated with the Library of Congress, regional librarians, a veteran historian of African-American culture and a Black feminist musician, an activist, Bernice Johnson Reagan of the SNCC Freedom Singers and Sweet Honey in the Rock, to compile the first album anthology of women's prison songs called From the Fieldwork of John A. Lomax and Herbert Halbert. And I should say it was Leon Litwack, who was the historian who contributed notes as well to this volume. While Rosetta Records served as the bedrock for her mission to recenter blues women's work in the national cultural imaginary, Rights embarked on a campaign to institutionalize the music and iconicity of these artists in multiple contexts, leading the effort to, for instance, honor Bessie Smith with a commemorative postage stamp and to have her inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. She compared her often to Eleanor Roosevelt. Rights, in short, was a multi-hyphenate wonder. Her entrepreneurial and activist vision was all-encompassing in such a way that it extended well beyond the label and into the realm of live performance, the functional part of this music, as she called it in a 1980 New York Times interview. And during that period, she curated landmark concerts that not only brought together veteran luminaries who'd long ago fallen out of the spotlight, path-breaking musicians like Sippy Wallace, Big Mama Thornton, and others, but she also used the concert events themselves to excavate blues women's archives and enlisting younger upstarts like Nell Carter and Coco Taylor and Carmen McRae to perform a repertoire of songs arranged in categories that, taken together, canonize the forgotten, with tributes to Bessie Smith and Lil Hardin Armstrong, and celebrated classic songs from across the century made famous by blues women from W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues to Taylor's 1978 song, I'm a Woman. As she declares in the program essay to 1981's Wild Women Don't Have the Blues concert, quote, I want to show that women didn't only sigh and cry when they sang the blues, but shouted in defiance too. They also gave instructions. The songs where the women state what they want in an unequivocal way instead of reacting to what they get are thrilling, end quote. But arguably, Wright's greatest and heretofore unheralded legacy was in the realm of music criticism, in my opinion. As I demonstrate in my book chapter about Wright's, she's clearly, I argue, one of our most formidable blues and jazz music critics, as well as a focused second wave feminist critic, perhaps one of the only feminists of her generation to consistently and extensively champion the aesthetic work of Black women musicians as a vital and central component, the bedrock of American culture, vital and central component to, and the bedrock of modern American culture. Her voluminous body of work, which includes dozens of meticulously crafted and heavily researched liner notes essays, of which you see a couple of examples here on women's blues and jazz, not only make her worthy of recognition, but also illuminate the myriad ways that Rosetta Wright's fundamentally revolutionized intellectual discourse on Black women's musicality. No study of Black women in music should, in my opinion, overlook the groundbreaking critical methodologies and style of analysis that Wright's brought to her writing, since her work sought to change the playing field in which Black women musicians emerged as topics of interest and value among critics as well as among fans. She cultivated a new critical language, a new lens through which we might engage these artists and apprehend their often stunning, moving, exhilarating artistic choices. Her cultural theories and critical strategies for affirming Black women of sound anticipate the sensual and improvisational moves and archival impulses of a figure like Janelle Monáe. They also recall the performative intimacies, high affect, and collector's curatorial vision of Lady Z, as I like to refer to her, and Abby Lincoln's recognition of Black women artists as social mood critics who are urgently attuned to the worlds in which they are situated. Wright's the intellectual, the indie record label mogul, the fan, brought all of these concerns together in her writing and left behind some liner notes to accompany Black women's subterranean sonic revolution. For the remainder of my remarks today, I'd like to pivot to a point in my work where I explore an absolutely fascinating and provocative phenomenon, which I came across while sifting through the more than 36 boxes of materials held in the Rosetta Wright's papers at Duke University's David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. What is the proper language? What are the syntactical structures, the analytic allusions available to a woman critic intent on doing so much with the music, covering so much historical, social, and aesthetic territory in her prose? Rosetta Wright's archive reveals that she consistently drew on and used published literary reviews, music journalism, and especially arts journalism as a laboratory to cultivate her own method of analysis, her critical lexicon, so to speak, the tenor of her own written voice. This, for her, one might imagine, was a different type of feminist revolution in letters, one in which she effectively engaged in a kind of intellectual heist, as I like to call it, occasionally lifting the language, strategies, and images of a cadre of men who wrote about art and who nonetheless had nothing to say about the art of Black women. Wright studied her fellow and nearly unanimously male critics hard, keeping clippings of and notes on the work that irked her, as well as documenting the work that she admired. She collected the outrageous, an obscure American arts magazine clipping featuring a quote from the legendary Whitney Balliet, esteemed New Yorker critic, stating that, quote, and this is Balliet, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I've actually never heard anyone pronounce Whitney Balliet's name. I know John Gennari would know this name well, since he has a landmark book on jazz music critics. But this is quote Balliet: women don't have the grace and poise to play jazz. Okay. As well as the material that had been largely relegated to the footnotes of history as well. This is something else that that Reitz would document in her own notes in her archive. A 1961 record research issue clipping describing how, quote unquote, Lil Armstrong spoke about her girl orchestra in 1932, something else she circled in her archive. She battled in the margins of her copies of books and articles by the prolific Black Studies cultural historian Donald Bogle, stating in her personal notes that, quote unquote, he is a sympathetic man, but does not have a female sensibility. One would hope for less generalization and more specific information about the women's contribution to American culture, end quote. And she, of course, had a particular bone to pick with Bessie Smith biographer Chris Albertson, quote unquote, he writes from a weird point of view, for it is as though he's a reluctant lover in the way he chooses to tell us about blues women. I wonder why he doesn't ever truly show Bessie as a winner in her life, being happy, but rather always being sad, quote unquote. And Chris Albertson did just pass away last year. Really important archivist in terms of Bessie Smith blues history. Rosetta Reitz had some beef with him. She kept stacks and stacks of reviews and profiles and featured articles by jazz critics like Gary Giddens and the great Nat Hintoff, and New York Times music critics like Robert Palmer, John Perez, who is still writing for the Times today, John Rockwell, also still writing for the Times today, Peter Watrous, taking care to underline lyrical sentences and phrases, seemingly. On occasion, she reached out directly to independent critics like jazz scholar Stanley Dance, whose archive we have quite a bit of Stanley Dance's papers here, still uncatalogued here in the Gilmore Library at Yale that Brent Edwards and I have been, and Brian Kane and I have been discussing as well. So she reached out to Stanley Dance, whom she tapped as a resource and a bridge figure who communicated with veteran musicians for her in some cases. Dance's connection to legendary pianist Earl Hines, for instance, gave her the opportunity to gather information about trumpeter Valida Snow that other critics had overlooked. I wonder if I could impose on you, she ventured as she reached out to Dance in a letter. I wonder if I could impose on you to ask him a few questions for me. Women care so much for this material. Okay, so this is, she's reaching out to Dance to ask Earl Hines something about Valida Snow, right? Women care so much for this material. It is really lost history, and I consider it a privilege to try to retrieve some of it. I'm trying to get a feel for, seemingly, her persona, the kind of person she was. There are things I'm trying to find out. Is there a female voice instrumentally? Could you ask Earl, was her trumpet playing different from that of a man? Was she called Little Louie as a joke? Or did people think she sounded like him? Was she arrogant or modest about playing? Was she a friendly person? Was she foxy, feisty, outspoken, or shy? Was she what one would call regular? Or was she artificial? Did she practice the trumpet? Regular should be underlined, by the way, I'm sorry. Did she practice the trumpet a lot, a little, or not at all? Alberta Hunter says about herself that she was dicty. Would one use that word for Valida, end quote? Reitz is interested here and elsewhere in fleshing out and examining the complex identity formations that come to bear on a musician's sound, how she approached her instrument, and how she negotiated space with her fellow musicians. Persona, she suggests in this letter, is that which leaves an imprint on the music. It is an outgrowth of an artist's affective politics. Building whole women characters in her alternative history of the music was, at its core, a feminist endeavor that prioritized finding the lost women in the archive and making them legible and audible in multidimensional narrative registers. This kind of digging, this kind of researching and writing was its own form of critical virtuosity. It was complicated, painstaking, jigsaw puzzle-like prose writing at the draft stage that followed its own rules. Reitz shows a tendency to make notes on article clippings in red or black ink, interpolating feminine pronouns, tweaking phrases and underlining key words and phrases that pooled together constitute a storehouse of modifiers, metaphors, and similes that complement her focus on blues and jazz women's culture and artistry. A 1985 Carol Musk review of iconic feminist poet Adrienne Rich's The Fact of a Door Frame serves as an occasion to collect and calibrate Musk's language and formulations that Wrights would seemingly utilize in what she imagined to be a shared endeavor, writing along the edges of the article. And I don't have the clipping, unfortunately, but you're going to see extractions of Wright's marginalia here. So writing along the edges of the article, Wrights jots down words, stamina and pluck. And then to the side of the photo of Rich lurks an additional note, a kind of free-floating reminder to herself to, quote unquote, fully embrace these songs, suspend your own beliefs, and allow yourself to enter those of the singer, end quote. From the article itself, she pulls quotes that leave a map of her critical priorities, underlining unearthing a lost history and marking with her red pen elaborations on Rich's poetics that clearly speak to those of her blues women's repertoire. Quote, where love has grown disillusioned and truth simultaneously more commanding. That's her circling again, the Musk review, pulling out, extracting quotes. Wrights gravitates towards Musk's musical allusions in her review, locating the commonalities between poetry and song lyric, and finally adjusting the language of the article, bending it to meet her own analytic will. Musk's vivid metaphorical description of Rich's technique, that it is like, quote unquote, dialectical fire, that it produces poems of transcendent beauty, becomes songs of transcendent beauty once it's calibrated into Wright's prose and in her handwritten marginalia. Wrights further edits. These remarkable poets, the brackets are Wrights here, women, whose passionate excesses, those are her underlines. Is that right? Yeah, right. That should have been struck out here, right? Actually, that should have been an underline, I'm sorry. Whose passionate excesses, so that's not a strikeout, whose brilliant, terrifying leaps of faith often affect us more deeply than their ingrown success of our assemblage of approved poets. Okay, conventional songs is bracket for Wrights. This is an experiment trying to share Wrights in talk form. So thanks for your patience here. The poet and the blues woman meet up in her critical imaginary as twin innovators of intense aesthetic innovation, as risk takers who subvert and surpass convention. Musk's review was but one of many articles from the world of the arts that supplied Wrights with the discursive means to experiment with new ways of interpreting and, in her mind, elevating, and that's key, elevating the ways that Black women musicians' work was regarded by the wider public. Published concert and record reviews, especially cover the work of notable jazz musicians, were clearly of use to her in this project. In the archive, there are traces of Wrights grafting her own voice onto, for instance, that of critic John Wilson's in a review of jazz pianist Tony Tamborello's gig. And this is not in this portion of the clipping, but it continues onto another page. She weaves long melodies made up of one or two choruses of melodies that she floats over a light and swinging beat. Before scrambling and rearranging another cut of the prose to read, she lightly floats over the swinging beat. So again, she's extracting the prose from Wilson's review and melding it into another line of prose, original prose, or calibrated prose. Call this invagination, call this critical marronage, discursive subversion, perhaps even call it pure mimicry and analytic appropriation. But Wright's intriguing method here conveys the efforts of a music critic at work, rehearsing style, searching for the voice that best suits her argumentative needs. In her preparation to write the Dorothy Romps liner notes in particular, one sees her looking to jazz and classical music reviews for inspiration and direct formulations to hammer out her ideas. A Time magazine profile of Russian pianist Vladimir Feltsman by Michael Walsh provides a phrase, quote unquote, virtuoso's fire in his belly, that she revises for gender and repeats for herself in separate notes, borrowing additional modifiers from Walsh's article. This is language that does not make it into the final published version of the notes, but appears to have worked as something like clay foundation for Writes as she built the belletristic scaffolding for her own voice. But her most provocative resources were arguably reviews of visual artist and pop culture mainstay Time magazine, which she meticulously kept track of, in which she seemed to excavate the most extensively in her search for the ideal analytic angles through which to read Black women's music. It is clear from her research notes that Wrights regarded the sonic as akin to the visual, as demanding a language that could capture what is not just heard, but what can be seen in and through the music. She seemed to have lived for a long time inside of Robert Hughes's review of Irish-born painter Francis Bacon's landmark 1985 Tate exhibit, striking Bacon's name early in the article and replacing it with blues to read instead lexicon of blues, quote unquote, underlining Hughes's contention that Bacon, quote unquote, breaks the chains of pessimistic expectation by taking his prototypes beyond themselves into grandeur. On the right page here, I hope I am. Let me go back. I want you all to be able to follow this with me. And keep going. Marking the ways that he reads Bacon's use of lines like punctuation marks, commanding one to focus and look, and pointing out how certain images in his work shed their documentary purpose. Wrights hangs on, I've got this right here. Wrights hangs on to vivid phrases circling obstinate integrity in the article, and her notes build toward a crescendo of consolidated energy around conjoining the painter's aesthetics with those of the blues woman as she edits Hughes's words to read that, quote, this is, I think, what I want here, sorry, quote, the truth is that the Bacon one sees, hears, this time at the Tate, has much more in common with old masters. This kind of paint, singing, again, brackets or Wrights, surface is part of the work of delivering sensations, not propositions, and it is neither idly sumptuous nor ironically sexy. Wrights show signs of searching for the appropriate way to say much more than what has been conventionally said about blues women's vocalizing by way of drawing analogies to Bacon's complex, sensual palette of images. A skein of quote unquote tensions and paradoxes that surround all efforts to see, hear, as Wrights adds, let alone to paint, Wrights adds, sing about, the human figure condition, she adds, in an age of photography, flash, slash out rock, disco. So again, I just want to give the example of rehearsing and experimenting with analytic prose here. We'll see how well this comes across. Feel free to ask me any questions. She has invented for herself here in the privacy of her written notes, a form of punctuation, strike-throughs and underlines that is both ludic and lived in ways theorized by Black feminist performance studies heavyweight Jennifer Brody. If, as Brody argues in her singular study on the topic, that quote unquote, punctuation is the conduit that directs us to creation, the trace of an embodied act, the mark that records and accords affect and feeling, Wrights' lines are performances of her relationship to the criticism in question, performance archives of feeling and critical formulation. It is here that we see the phantom limb conjoining her writing with that of another, staging, as Brody puts it, an intervention between utterance and inscription, speech and writing, activism, activity and apathy, body and gesture. It is seen and unspoken, sounded and unseen, end quote. It is here in these boxes upon boxes of notes and scribblings that, quote, Rosetta writes, the improvisational feminist sound critic fully emerges, the woman who plays through and at the intersections of language and music, who takes chances and gambles with striking images and illusions, who is thrilled by and seeks a shared sense of exhilaration elicited by the blues, who pursues gratuitous and alluring difficulty in her prose about Black women's performances, who perpetually strives to translate forms of raw sonic experience into discursive style and musical storymaking. Think of Rosetta the improviser, sometimes impulsively, sometimes with slow, pointed care, jotting down her thoughts on scraps of paper, a half envelope here, a stained piece of binder paper there, perhaps on the flip side of a menopause manuscript draft page, freestyling a thesaurus of modifiers and predicates and actions for future use, voluptuous, gumption, perception, to perceive, meaning, conveyed, responsive, acuteness were lists of words that you would find scribbled on Post-it notes. Think of Rosetta keeping a map for herself of where she was headed in each of her products. This album, quote unquote, is about women's feelings, she marked on one note. Think of her as imparting crucial reminders to her future self to, quote unquote, listen to the wonderment. Think of her pushing her use of visual tropes, describing how Dorothy Donegan, quote unquote, plays colors on the palette of the keyboard from lyric pastels to stormy, vivid primaries with sweeping gestures, again on a Post-it note. Think of her as marveling over how she marveled over a musician's, quote unquote, gesticular statements of spontaneity, making it work aesthetically, again on a Post-it note. Her archive holds the many traces of a critic, a scholar, a historian who was furiously and endlessly productive, making pages and pages of lists of musician genealogies and challenging herself with large-scale riddles that she sought to solve. For instance, quote unquote, in looking at this music, I'm trying to find the answers to many questions that I raise and can't find the answer to bring to life the rhythms, the images, the sensuousness of a lost time, end quote. Think of her as pursuing queries that she was delighted to answer through her own research and analysis. Quote, what do you do with a paragon of creative invention who refuses to be a prisoner of the decades she lives in, she wrote to herself, Writes presciently asks. Her own simple answer to this question sums up the fundamental ethos of all of her efforts, quote unquote, you sit and listen and enjoy. In the unfinished book, which Wrights for many years worked on, all the way through up into her death in 2008, she held forth as she did in all her work, insisting to the end that women, quote unquote, added new territory to the map of American music. They both set new standards for singers to come, this is still Wrights, yet received no honors or prizes for their distinction and have been maligned by many, end quote. In her own relative obscurity, she shared much in common with many of the women she championed. But what the first woman to run her own blues women's record label and author a trove of liner notes essays gave us was a manifestation of the multitudes, just like the music she so adored. She set out to set the record straight, and one would imagine she had to have hoped that someone was out there listening closely to both the sounds of these formidable artists and the grand ideas that she drew out of said sounds. She had to have dreamed of the next feminist music lover who was ready to spin these discs yet again and lovingly converse with them, just as she had done. Thank you so much. And I look forward to any questions about Rosetta Wrights, anything we want to talk about today. And I hope it came across, especially your notes. I'm like, how am I going to do this? But
Professor Brooks, I'm going to jump in here and just thank you for an outstanding lecture. What a fascinating topic. I was completely enthralled. And what I'd like to do is just welcome those who are out there in the world attending virtually we are opening the Q&A now. It's been open. And if you'd like to just pop in some questions, we've got some help backstage helping me manage all this. And I'm going to try to read out some questions and ask you for some quick answers. So I actually would just like to start with a first question that I had. I think it's just incredibly inspiring to hear you uh, describe an archivist of care, a woman who is an archivist of care.
Yes.
And for me, just of course, personally, that's just so lovely. And why I think so is because not only that she existed, that she lived her life in a way that exhibited
Mhm.
that mentality, but also as a researcher scholar that you saw that
Mhm.
through her imprint in the archives and through her historical record.
Mhm.
Can you please tell us a little bit about that moment where you realized that, where you
Mhm.
put that idea together and it came to
Mhm.
fruition in
Mhm. Thank you for that question. It was the moment I sat down in the Rubenstein Library and got the first box, um, which I didn't start with biography, which is one of the earliest boxes. Um, I was starting with notes because I, at that point, was really interested in the journey that Rosetta Writes had taken to really building her prodigious critical essays that I've been discussing. And in starting with the notes, with the marginalia, so to speak, the post-it notes and, little like stacks and stacks of little pads that, would have like 3 or 4 pages, like just completely filled up. And then there'd be another pad. It just became clear that there was a very intimate process that she took so seriously in trying to honor the archives that she was recuperating, and that I was, I needed to be committed to telling her story intimately, whatever that means, and we can talk a lot more about that. But it was a kind of, it was just very much evident in the material traces in the archive, that her project was a project of care. And some of the last quotes that I read speak to her kind of, just long-standing indignation at the ways in which Black women's sonic artistry had been disregarded in the American cultural imaginary. So for her, the rejoinder was to move with care and a sense of really kind of jealous protectiveness, with regards to their archives. So I don't know if that's getting at what you're asking me, but
Yes, wonderful. I think I'd like to, another questions come in related to that, so I think I'll pick up on that here. And what can we learn uh, about effective, passionate, and authentic allyship from Rosetta Rates?
Yay, what a great question. Thank you for that. Um, I think that she and well, I'll leave that there. This comes up at other points in the book, but I think she's a really important reminder of what it means to do grassroots cultural activism and to imagine yourself as an ally who can champion and respectfully work alongside artists across the color line, so to speak, and outside of your own community in the pursuit of a kind of radical feminist, and I would definitely say Black feminist liberation politics. So she's someone who I think really understood and, was mindful of what it meant to engage in any kind of intellectual work with humility. She's exemplary of the kind of intellectual humility that should be important to all of us in academia, being curious, and being open to and devoted to, knowledge production, but also consuming knowledges that can expand and deepen and sharpen your own ability to engage in knowledge production. So you see in her archive, a real kind of rigor in exploring and becoming a student of African-American history, not just blues women's music, but the broader history of the Great Migration, for instance, and Atlantic world slavery more broadly. And I think that is a real kind of it's something that was lacking in blues music criticism, designed by the patriarchs across the 20th century. And I think she understood that was the counter kind of critical work that she needed to do. And in that sense, she emerges as an ally who wants to know more and wants to be able to forward the voices of the artists themselves, as opposed to becoming the colonizing voices for them.
Did she, just a quick follow-up, did you sense or see any evidence of her own self-awareness as the scholar, researcher, coming from the perspective of being a white woman? Did you see any evidence of that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. She never wrote about it specifically, as far as I can tell. And there are a couple other people, I should say, who are doing great work on Rosetta rights. Very famously, Sarah Haley, in her field-altering book, No Mercy Here, the last chapter of No Mercy Here, she draws on the Jailhouse Blues recordings. Sophia Bromwitz, who's on the line, I believe, today, and even if she isn't, is doing work on Rosetta as well. So she doesn't benefit from some of the more cutting edge and important whiteness studies by Dave Rudiger and Matt Gutturl and Matt Jacobson and others. She doesn't have that kind of theorizing of selfhood in that way. But she does have a kind of, I would say, mindfulness about when to get out of the way of these blues women who were trying to narrate their own, who were trying to construct their own life worlds. Right? She was very much about, let me be the platform for you to be able to showcase the fundamental innovations that you made to American culture. And I will say that in the chapter too, she's not above having some, I think, knee-jerk moments that are, this is not an apologist at all, but related to age, in terms of, just kind of politics of respectability kinds of observations that she makes about, say, an Ella Fitzgerald and her kind of, refined singing versus that of some of the other blues women's vocalists. What I would add to that, though, is that she doesn't denigrate those women who fall outside of that, category of putative refinement. But the fact that, there's a distinction in calling, one kind of line of vocalizing refined and another not is an issue that I raise as being a little bit concerning.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go on to another question from one of our audience members. Could you say more about the idea of calibrated prose? Have you encountered such a characteristic in other archives, in the material left behind by other critics? The idea of calibrated prose is fantastic, and I can't wait to engage it in other ways. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't. This is the first time I'd ever seen anything like this. And I was really interested in it because, I also write about it in the book and try to be transparent about having been a fan of music criticism for many years growing up before I became a professional academic, and really consuming rock music criticism in particular, which, had no place for a Black girl from California or anywhere else in the world to really fit in. And yet I read that arts journalism very closely, and know that my voice was influenced by that work, and at the same time I fought with it. And so what resonated for me in Rights' archive, and I repeat, I've never seen it before, is her actually fighting, discursively with the critics, and sometimes, writing alongside, to use, Eve Sedgwick's famous formulation, influential formulation, writing alongside of some of the feminist critics as well. So the Carol Musk article, which I was trying to retrieve so you guys could see it ahead of time, the Carol Musk article was so crucial to her, that review of Adrienne Rich in the New York Times. And so I do think that there's both a kind of combative way that she's, calibrating the criticism at her disposal. And there's also, I like to think, a sort of hybrid collaborative way as well, that she's, drawing on various kinds of critical lexicons in order to speak a language that hadn't been spoken before in print broadly, which is, a feminist, revisionist, extensive reading of a wide variety of blues women's recordings. It just hadn't been done before that way, right? I tried to work delicately through in the chapter, like the different ways, we might characterize what she's doing, because there are some people that say she listed a formulation from, Wilson or Perales. And, but I think that there was something so pointed about how she was trying to intervene in canons of cultural hierarchy, that it was important for her to actually use to extract the language of, elevated, art criticism, and the notion of elevating certain kinds of art and valuing certain kinds of art, and using that same language to talk about blues women's music. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So let's go on to another. This is from Sophie Abramowitz. Pardon me. I apologize.
Sophie,
Would you mind?
badass.
I'm
What
so
you
sorry.
got, Sophie?
So her question is, would you mind talking about the relationship that you see between these improvisatory and experimental fragments and her liner notes for the records? I apologize. I'm having a little issue seeing my notes here.
Oh, I was too. So we're all together in the
Looking
SIP
very
universe. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think, Sophie, that you can see in some of the notes how some of that language made it directly into the final cut, so to speak, of the liner notes themselves. But this is a place to really push and think about to what extent were these moments of critical maroonage a kind of, let's go with the puns, tuning up, right? Just kind of, or a Zora trope, sharpening her oyster knife, so to speak. That they became a kind of more of a hermeneutic way of trying to get at the music. And I think it did both things. I think that there were places where she was building drafts of what would become her actual essays. And at other places, it was really about kind of coming to terms with, well, this particular critic in Time magazine is writing about this Matisse exhibit. And, what if we could imagine, an exhibit with the kind of bells and whistles on it that a Matisse exhibit has for Bessie Smith, which now we can, I think, and that's largely because of what Rosetta Writes opened up for us in the early 80s, alongside of, that powerhouse, array of Black feminist critics from that period who were recuperating the blues. And I would include Anne Dasile in that whole generation of critics, and the late great Cheryl Wall, and of course Hazel Carby, my colleague, and of course Daphne Duval Harrison, and then Angela Davis as well. So, and then Farrah Griffin, 20th anniversary of her If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday collection. So just to kind of think about how, Wrights was really sort of creating this informal space to just kind of theorize is what I really saw in the notes. But yes, there were some places where you could see the carryover between the two.
Okay. So I'm going to go on and maybe ask just a couple more questions. I'm kind of monitoring time here and want to be respectful of your time as well. Here's a great one about the creation of archives. Mm-hmm. In thinking about sonic and performance archives, again from an audience member, what archival approaches may we establish in our contemporary moment to ensure that Black women's sonic contributions are preserved? Specifically, I'm thinking of the Black women musicians engaging in their own archival practice and how this might unlock a delineation between public and private self.
Beautiful question. I mean, the dream would be, in following the inspiration of the Pembroke Center and what you all are up to with this incredible project, would be to have some kind of similar endeavor, both with a whole, a vast array of musicians, both, top world, as we like to call it, mainstream superstars, but also some of our, local regionalized amateur musicians, as well as the fans. And we know that there are many things we could say about fan collectives now in our 21st century moment, but being able to document all of that and really pay attention to that as a phenomenon that is a point of knowledge production would be thrilling. I mean, I think the challenge that we've run into, and I want to be careful, but I know certain archives have run into this problem, You know, and this has everything to do with, you know, histories of violence and disenfranchisement, and is that you have African-American performers who are wary of handing their materials over to archives because they haven't received the kind of restitution, you know, like that for any of their labor, you know, they don't want to give it up. I mean, this is true of my other half, Matthew Fred Jacobson, worked for many years on the kind of the just biographical work around one of the legendary barrier breakers in Major League Baseball, Dick Allen, who just passed away. And Dick Allen was not willing to, should I say this is going to be public? He just was uncomfortable with the idea, he and his family, of, you know, sitting for interviews or, you know, sharing any of his personal materials without being paid. You know, he'd been, so I think we've kind of run into that as an issue, but you know, we've got wonderful people at foundations who are out of the Black radical tradition now, who are hopefully going to keep helping us with that. And of course, the Smithsonian Museum for African American History is another place that we can go. But I think that is something, young archivists on the line, is something we should be doing. You know, Beyonce should have an archive. And she has one in her work itself. I argue that Lemonade is itself an archive, but how extraordinary would it be to actually have a place to go to be able to see, you know, the ways in which our contemporary performers are collaborating and, you know, generating, you know, all sorts of experimentations with their own artistic practices.
Okay, thank you. So let's see, how about if we do one more question here, and we'll take it from there. Okay, this is from another audience member. One of the challenges and often frustrations we see among contemporary Black artists, particularly Black women, is their struggle to manage their creative identities alongside against critical understandings and representations of the meaning of their race and gendered identities in their work. Mm-hmm. To what extent did Writes engage with these challenges in her analysis of blues and jazz women's work? Did she ever write or speak about managing any of these kinds of anxieties about her responsibility to these artists as a critic? How did she discuss women's work that she did not necessarily love?
Thank you for that question. To the last question, she didn't. I mean, actually, I referenced that. I mean, she was very, in the chapter I talk about, if there's any weakness in her body of work, it's that she championed, you know, all of these women to such an extent that some of the nuances and complexities about, you know, their music were left to the wayside. And that was, I think, a political choice that she made, you know, that it was going to be, you know, an endeavor that was about shedding light on virtuosity and nothing else for the most part. And then the other piece of that question, could you read it to me again? That was really rich.
Yep, let me scroll. Okay, it says here, one of the challenges and often frustrations we see among contemporary Black artists, particularly Black women, is their struggle to manage their creative identities alongside against critical understandings and representations of the meaning of their race and gendered identities in their work. Mm-hmm. To what extent did Writes engage with these challenges in her analysis of blues and jazz women's work?
So how did, I want to make sure I'm understanding this, how did Writes go about addressing the kinds of, the sort of cultural myopia attached to the women as they circulated, as they circulated their work?
This questioner goes on to write, did she ever write or speak about managing any of these kinds of anxieties or about her responsibilities to these artists as a critic?
So the anxieties of the artists.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Got it. You know, that doesn't really, no, actually, you know, there are places where she's very clear in marking the ways that these women, many were mindful of the fact that they hadn't received their due, that they, you know, had not been taken seriously in a previous era. And, the title of this talk comes from Dorothy Donegan referring to her as being sort of like an archaeologist, right? Dorothy Donegan in the early 90s, she was just this extraordinary musician, this virtuosic pianist who, was multifaceted in terms of her generic adventurousness. I think Dorothy Donegan, for instance, some of these older musicians that Brights was able to reconnect with, felt a sense of gratitude, wonder, and also, just exhilaration at being taken seriously for their musicianship, as opposed to being scripted through, the intersectional subjugations that Black women have obviously historically faced. So, there is documentation of that kind of sense of gratitude. And also for Donegan, it sort of revitalized her interest in being an artist. She'd performed across her career, but she gives like these incredible, is holding these incredible gigs in Los Angeles around the time that Wrights is reissuing her music. So there is a kind of, beautiful symmetry between Wrights recuperating their archival selves and then being able to then, perform themselves into the futurity of what they could imagine through Wrights laying claim to the power of what they did.
And here's just a quick last question for those who might be interested. Do you know if Wrights' Rosetta records are still in circulation?
Oh, that's a great question. So you can find them on Amazon, not to give Jeff Bezos more money. And they're, some are in print still, I believe maybe Mean Mothers, but only a few out of the, nearly 24. But you can, they're, on eBay, they're available on eBay. You can also get them through MP3s and MP4s on Amazon as well. And then I would be remiss if I didn't note the fact that her extraordinary daughter, Rebecca Wrights, has a tribute page. If you just Google Rosetta Wrights tribute page, I should have put it up in the chat. That has a whole range of articles on Rosetta. And I forgot to include the image of this we can maybe end on, but Rebecca wrote to a few of us at the end of last year, was it? Or maybe it was during pandemic, that there's a street in the Netherlands that was named after a Wrights, who was an Aryan white supremacist Nazi. And grassroots activists in this town in the Netherlands decided, mobilized to say, we want to take this particular name down and rename it after a Wrights that speaks to the vision of what, our world could be. And they just went online and researched and found Rosetta Wrights. And now the street is named after Rosetta Wrights. I should have included that in the images. Yeah, it's incredible. It's a great end of the story. Or beginning. Yeah, new beginning.
Well, I want to thank you just so much for taking your time and preparing this talk during this pandemic. It's just a big ask, and we are just so appreciative of your time. And of course, we are thrilled to welcome your papers down the line into the Black Feminist Theory collections at the Pembroke Center Archives. With that, I will wish good evening to all of those who attended, and thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for everybody for coming. Thank you.